Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Blue and Green 2021 webinar series, which has included 4 one-hour seminars scheduled on a variety of Thursdays. This is webinar 3 series. Next week, there is the 4th and final next Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And as many of you know, OPC is an amazing organization and entity located at the Port of Los Angeles, and is really leading the way on a lot of issues relative to our ocean and agriculture and so much more. And so we're excited to have this program today and the various speakers that you'll get to hear from shortly. I do want to mention something that is coming up, but their mentorship program that OPC is offering this summer. High schoolers are encouraged to participate in their research program, which is going to study sustainable agriculture with Holdfast Agriculture co-founder Dr. Nathan Churches, or with graduate students from the Oregon State University's Pacific Marine Energy Center. The application can be found on their website, the OPC Project Blue High School and research programs, and the mentorship programs. They're due the applications May 31st, and students' scientific papers will be published on the OPC's website, and volunteer hours will be awarded. It sounds like a really wonderful program. I didn't introduce myself, sorry, in the beginning. My name is Wendy Gruhl, and I'm former controller for the city of Los Angeles. And also the connection here is I'm also an executive in residence at Cal State Northridge at the Nazarian College of Business and Economics, as well as the university as a whole. And so this partnership is so very, very exciting. As many of you know, the goal of this project is to shine a light on and spotlight on emerging aquacultural sector in our economy, bringing a lot of the technologies together, the ingredients together. So that's future growth opportunities that support our coastal ecosystems, the economy, our jobs, and our communities. And this webinar is like reimagining partnerships between the various levels, whether it be business or government or universities and communities, through regenerative ocean research, exploration, and particularly equity-based economic development, which is so critical. So today's kind of format will be, I'm going to ask each of our speakers that I will introduce to say a few words of introduction and some opening themes. And I'm going to briefly give you a bio about each of them. And so hopefully I will try to be quick about that because they have major accomplishments. So I'm going to abbreviate a little bit. I'm going to introduce all of you, and then I will turn back to you as well. The first I'm going to introduce is Mark Gold. He is Associate Vice Chancellor for Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and has particularly focused his research on integrated water management, coastal resource management, and urban sustainability. He is spearheading UCLA's first ever Grand Challenge, the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, which you could talk a little bit about, Mark, in your remarks. He is a lifetime Bruin, both your bachelor's and master's degree from UCLA, and you were in the UCLA School of Public Health Hall of Fame, which is fabulous, and the James Irvine Foundation Leadership Award and Aspen Institute Cato Fellowship. He serves as with Mayor Garcetti's Water Task Force and a city rep on the Metropolitan Water District. And prior to this, he, which is where I first met him, was a leader at Hilda Bay for over 18 years. So we'll be excited. I'll come back to you in a moment. Michael Kelly serves as the Executive Director of the LA Coalition for the Economy and Jobs. I have the honor and privilege to be part of that group, a nonprofit bipartisan coalition, that organization that brings together really unique individuals and high-level leaders from business, labor, academia, and nonprofits to really advance initiatives that talk about economic growth, creating quality jobs, a skilled workforce, and overall really improving the quality of life of Los Angeles. He serves as chair of the Fuse Corps LA Advisory Committee, founding chair of the Philanthropic Foundation for Cal State University Dominguez Hills, a partner at Saving the West, and an advisory board for Working Nation, and a steering committee member for Committee for Greater LA, which you might want to also talk a little bit about today, Michael. And Sandra Whitehouse, who's coming to us from the East Coast today, is a consultant who's using her marine experience, science experience to advise clients on ocean policies focused on how to advance ocean health and sustainability and sustainably develop coastal and offshore projects. Her clients have included governments, corporations, companies, and nonprofit organizations. And she serves as the senior policy advisor to the Ocean Conservancy and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's also on the board of the National Council for Science and the Environment, and she holds a BS from Yale University and a PhD from Rhode Island, and is just one of those individuals that has such broad-based experience. And we're excited to have you, all of you, with us today. And so I want to first give you, Mark, an opportunity to say a few words about what it is you're doing right now, and some opening thoughts.
Thanks, Wendy. And I'm always a Bruin, so I will say that up front, but and I'm still an adjunct faculty member at UCLA. But for the last 2 years, I'm actually Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy for the state of California, as well as the Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. So that's actually a better fit, I think, for this panel than urban sustainability, but I'm glad to answer any questions there as well.
Well, you're always a Bruin, you know, just say always a Bruin. So we never let you go from that, but glad that you're also doing so much on the state of California, which is not unique, and is something you obviously did as at UCLA.
Yeah, well, thank you. One of the things I just, and hopefully we can touch upon it more in the Q&A, is that with the leadership of Secretary Crowfoot from the Natural Resources Agency, we've just finished internally, and it'll be released, not in a big fanfare or anything like that, but at the Ocean Protection Council next quarterly meeting on June 15th, Guiding Principles for Sustainable Marine Aquaculture in California. And these principles were put together by senior leadership from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game Commission, Ocean Protection Council, Food and Ag Agency, Department of Public Health, Coastal Commission, and State Lands Commission. And so it's basically going to give us interim guidelines to follow in the next couple of years, while a statewide aquaculture action plan is being developed by the state, led by NCEAS at UC Santa Barbara. That's the National Center for Eco-Analysis and Strategies. And they'll be working with UC Sea Grant and putting together that aquaculture action plan, which will be the first one we've ever had in the state of California, which is something that people in the aquaculture community have been clamoring for, is some sort of certainty on what California really wants to achieve. And in those interim guidelines that we're following, and this is just very broad and can get into it more later, but it's pretty common sense stuff. Develop and utilize best available science, ensure aquaculture sustainability, build governance and management partnerships, ensure effective aquaculture planning, develop and implement effective and efficient aquaculture oversight, and last, but certainly not least, protect public health and food safety. And so I just wanted to leave it at that, but it's really an exciting time within the Newsom administration on aquaculture and the Natural Resources Agency. And just to get agriculture and public health involved, I can't even tell you how exciting that is and what a big deal that is in the aquaculture arena. And so I just wanted to share that with you and your audience. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark, and look forward to even further on the Q&A to hear more about that. I want to next introduce Michael Kelly. And Michael, as part of your introduction, I think it'd be interested on how, and maybe you can include this with what you're doing at the coalition and its engagement on the blue economy. What does that mean, and why did the group necessarily get interested in that?
Sure, thank you. And just to kind of to preface my comments throughout the next hour is, part of my job is, Wendy's part of the group, CSUN is part of the group, is put together really smart, bright thinkers on some of the issues that are impacting the ability for someone to get a skill, to get a job, to build a physical infrastructure to support, jobs in the economy. And, one of the roles is, as I put these people together, we've been highly successful, as you can see who's on this panel. So I'm not gonna, I'm low end of the pecking order and I'm gonna know about some of these topics. So, but anyway, so back to the, back on the coalition front, as Wendy mentioned, like we're trying to build a more equitable economy. We're trying to build better paying jobs, create better paying jobs and help people get the skills to get those jobs. And in doing that, we're trying to figure out, what industries are going to employ Angelenos moving forward? What are the drivers of the economy, not the supporters of the economy? And one of the great things that are coming out of LA, born from our history of aerospace, has been new space. And tied to that, even that, the legacy tied into, blue economy now, which some people are still trying to get their arms around and trying to figure that out. And part of the other part of my work is, as we work on this stuff, is working on the infrastructure. Just because we have new space going gangbusters or tech and everything else, is people need affordable housing. People need great schools with great resources, so they don't pay a fortune to get the skills they need to get some of these jobs that are being created here. We need obviously better transportation options, and everything's talking about now is more fast and affordable, accessible broadband. So the blue economy is something. I grew up in Massachusetts and Cape Cod. Family members still have oyster grants, lobster, they have lobster pots and all that stuff. So I know I have a family history around the ocean, and being here out in the Pacific, I'm instilling the same thing into my kids. So I've got a great love for it. And having been introduced to the leaders like Jenny Caruso at AltaSea and the work that they're doing, I've been 100% supportive for a number of years now. And I think it's fascinating what they're doing down there. And you look at the data around it from the LA Economic Development Corporation just a couple of years ago, talking about the massive impact, talking about roughly 7% of the state's overall workforce is now linked somehow directly or indirectly through induced jobs to the oceans and things around the oceans. And it's not just the port, right? This is actually the sustainability of life. If the rest of the world ate like Americans did, we'd be running out of meat and food and everything else. And we're going to have to go back to what people used to eat as part of their diet over 100 years ago: oysters, mussels, and some of the other stuff. And so, I look forward to the great potential that lies ahead for this region, and I'm going to keep on just kind of hammering away on it until people fully comprehend and understand what we're doing.
Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate it. And Sandra, you are a leader across the country on this issue. And so would love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing right now and any other kind of opening thoughts.
Thank you. Well, first, let me embellish my short bio with probably the most relevant and important part of my career, which was that I served as the Chief Scientific Officer for AltaSea from 2015 to 2019, and still stay in close touch with them and what they're doing. One of the first things that Jenny Caruso and Michael Kelly and with input from Mark Gold and others did was to define what were the first clusters at AltaSea going to be. And it became clear really early on that sustainable aquaculture was rising to the top. And the reason for that was that there was already sort of a nexus of business interests, educational opportunities, and scientific capacity in that area and with the work that was being done. So it's very exciting to see it continue to move forward. I think the other thing just to mention, I also serve on the high-level panel for Sustainable Ocean Economy, which is a group of 14 countries that are looking at developing a shared vision for our oceans with respect to developing the blue economy. And this is an issue that really has international interest. So I think, what your discussions are at AltaSea and beyond are also going to be relevant to many other countries. And we have an opportunity to also learn from both their progress as well as some of the mistakes that have been made. So this is beyond just LA. This is, I think this is international. And one of the things that I hope to expand upon a little bit more later is the importance of being able to find a site for the aquaculture farm itself. Our oceans are very busy. There's lots of other things going on. There's shipping, there's commercial fishing, there's ecological resources. And so having a process for ocean planning that allows aquaculture farms to be sited in the most appropriate places is going to continue to be very important.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think, what we learn and know in California and across the country is so important for the world. And your perspective on that would be interesting as well, to kind of see how we ensure that best practices and things that we learn are shared all over the world, because we all know in the issue of climate change and everything that is happening, we can't be in our own little silos, and what we're learning and doing is so critical, and what OPC is doing. For those of you that might be watching the webinar, and if you've not been down to the Port of Los Angeles and to OPC and what they're doing and the opportunities that are there, I encourage all of you. I went there several years ago with Jenny and others to kind of see as they were just beginning, and to see what all of you, Sandra and Michael and others have done to make OPC what it is today is pretty spectacular. So thank you. I'm going to go back to Mark for you for a minute. And now that you're kind of statewide perspective and working with the and there's, oftentimes, and I'm going to kind of ask the same, a little bit of question back to you, Michael, afterwards. So heads up, which is, the challenge between the ecosystem benefits and economic benefits. Oftentimes they're pitted against one another, when instead they, as they say, all boats rise together, no pun intended there. But how do you see that from your perspective, where you sit, that the missing links maybe between ecosystem benefits and economic benefits?
Yeah, so we put out at the Ocean Protection Council a strategic plan for California's coasts and oceans about a year ago. And the balance there were 4 pillars: climate, biodiversity, blue economy, and equity. And so very, very clearly, we highlighted the interaction between those. And the 2 big blue economy issues right now, let's face it, are probably offshore wind, which you're going to hear more about and maybe Sandra can give us advice on how it's going where she lives. But California is looking into that very, very seriously. And the other one, of course, is aquaculture. And one of the things that we've seen in aquaculture is there's been so many fits and starts in the state of California. There are certain areas where shellfish does really well, other areas where, there's been some not so successful outcomes with aquaculture. And as such, and with much of the discussion around it, we decided at the state, one of the ways to move forward on this was to say, let's get shellfish and algae right. So we're highlighting from the standpoint of sustainability on the ocean side and state waters, that really the principles themselves that I laid out and the aquaculture action plan that's being developed, that the real focus there is going to be in those 2 areas. And it doesn't mean that finfish won't be addressed somewhere down the line, but in the state of California, we just haven't been able to do this in a very cohesive, integrated way, and really balance, public health, ecosystem needs, and blue economy needs in that way. And there's a general consensus that we should be able to do that without too much difficulty, focusing on shellfish and algae. And so that to me is one of the big components here. I think that was brought up by both Sandra and yourself. Issue on siting is another very, very critical issue. And so we have sort of 2 parallel things going on right now with NOAA. I can't recall whether they've spoken on this already, but the aquaculture opportunity area process right now that they're looking at within the Southern California Bight. Not a lot of spaces that don't have the other uses that Sandra was talking about. Defense is actually the biggest conflicting use in federal waters. And, we would like nothing better then that the state of California approach would be consistent with the federal approach. And so that's something else that we're working on at the same time. So all of this, you're hearing from me, from the Ocean Protection Council, and but the lead, I just want to make sure that everybody knows, is Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission. But because we're part of the Secretary's office, reporting, which has a space in the governor's cabinet, we're really taking that convening and leadership and policy role to really bring everybody together. So I hope that helps answer the question.
It does, and again, highlight some of the challenges, which I think is always what the webinars and series discussions are important about, what's working and where we need to advocate for government to do something differently, or where there are rubs, so that we can work on that. And I would say, Michael, and turning to you on this, a lot of you're representing businesses and others. Where do you see kind of a change in how businesses are engaged in this? And two, if you're out there and you're listening to this and you have no idea how to get into aquaculture, what would you suggest to them? What would be the, advise them to do to get in that blue economy? Because most people, if you say there's the blue economy, and I jokingly might say the Dodger economy, in Los Angeles, because we're the Dodgers. But how would you explain that?
Yeah, and that's what part of my role is, because as I learn in real time here from Mark and the announcement, it's such welcome news even from the last week when I moderated the panel and talking about some of the challenges. I was thinking through this thing, because that was some of the questions we had last week too. Is you think about people kind of upskilling, reskilling in this new kind of rapid changing world, and some people that maybe they were a lobster person and they want to get into aquaculture and farming and all that. And there's a big question is, I thought through it for some of these people. First thing I'd recommend anybody that's, interesting, even from investors, anybody who wants to reskill themselves, or a student or anybody else, is go to the AltaSea website, because one of the roles is, right, it's a business incubation. And from the days when we started with AltaSea, with Sandra and Jenny and everybody else, what do we have? We had probably the one, the seaweed farming, and then, Blue Robotics, this young kid working out of his garage, he had a full-time job in aerospace. This is the link between aerospace and robotics and all that other stuff. Working out of his garage, created Blue Robotics, undersea, drones and everything else. So I'd go to the AltaSea website, you look at all the companies now that are linked to AltaSea, and get an understanding of what they're doing, how they started. And then you've got the investors, right? Always follow the money. The braid theory being the incubator too, within the incubator, and doing some great stuff. And just it was fascinating learning from Dr. Kim, one of the founders of the Holdfast Aquaculture, and she was talking about what she is doing, which was pretty fascinating about at the local level, because part of the issue too is everybody wants maybe a Cape Cod oyster or Maine lobster at their local farmer's market, at their fancy restaurant in LA. Is like, how do we make sure that if we do grow this industry here, and you're able to do the regenerative seaweed off the coast, and that employs somebody, and it's able to feed the development of scallops and mussels and all the other stuff. How do we make it sure that locally sourced stuff, we don't ship out our best seafood stock to the world, which we do, gets to the local markets, and so there's the supply chain opportunities there. Then all the other stuff tied to that. And then you look at it too, is what Dr. Kim's company is doing too, is they've got a footprint in South LA, because, seafood shouldn't just be about, serving, high-end restaurants. It's about what we're talking about, making sure that people have equal access to good, healthy foods. And they've created partnerships in some of our most under-resourced, underserved communities. And then I would go, recommend, obviously, that's the whole reason we put this blue and green webinar together, is you go back and you listen to the people from the first one, from last week's one, people who are listening now, and the fourth one. It was fascinating to hear the different perspectives of who's doing what, and where they're making progress, where they're not making progress. And then trying to think, and yeah, and the other part too is someone recommended, you can't Like you can't be it if you can't see it, right? And part of this is that connectivity is, part of my role is to really highlight, like, what's the blue economy? What does it look like? Who's doing what? And to some people who want to either invest in it, going back into, looking at all these different companies. But the other part too is people that want to maybe be a part of it and get a job or start up a company in it, is go work for her, go bang on doors and see what you can do. Because I think it seems like, from what I've learned, it's going to be extremely difficult for someone to come out of the blue and be like, I want to start my own farm. I need my permit. I got to figure out the laws, the rules, the regulations. And, it took, I think, Maine and New Zealand, like more than 2 decades to figure through some of this stuff. So yeah, I think there's massive opportunity, but first we got to let people understand what exactly it is.
Right, what the blue economy is, what agriculture is. And so Sandra, I would turn to you. I mean, I think that 2 sides of it. Again, you have the Atlantic and the Pacific perspective, and a little bit in public policy makers and what what kind of decisions are being made on a national level and an international level that are either supporting or challenging sustainable agriculture.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to just put a fact out there, since some of our listeners and participants may not be as intimate with this as we are. When we're talking about California state waters, that's only 3 miles out. Federal waters are our EEZ, our exclusive economic zone, goes all the way 200 miles out. So that's the difference between, what state regulators are looking at and managers versus some of the federal efforts. And, in terms of policymakers, it was great to hear from Mark about the work that California is doing. California, as usual, will probably lead the way on this in terms of defining what our national standards might become. I'll put a little plug in from Rhode Island, my home state. We have actually worked on aquaculture for quite a while. And one of the things that we determined about 12 years ago was what we call the 5% rule, which is that no body of water should have more than 5% of the surface area covered by an aquaculture facility. And that was based on really sound science, as well as what Mark was talking about, user conflicts. That particular number may or may not hold for other areas. But my point is that states have a very important role to play, the state policymakers, in terms of how aquaculture is going to be developed. And then on the federal level, Mark mentioned the AOA's aquaculture opportunity areas, which are basically defined geographic areas that are being evaluated by NOAA to see whether they're suitable for commercial aquaculture. And that's not only looking at the ecological resources, but also, again, minimizing conflicts. So Southern California and the Gulf of Mexico are the 2 that have been defined, which just came out earlier this month. And then another 2 will come out next year. The other thing that will happen next year is that there'll be basically what's called a programmatic EIS, which is going to really be sort of a plan for aquaculture development, not a pre-permitting, but some guidelines for aquaculture permitting in that area. And then the one other thing that's happening on the federal level in the Senate was in 2020. It was called the Aqua Act, because in Congress you always have to have a good acronym for whatever you're doing. I don't know who comes up with them, but Aqua stands for Advancing the Quality and Understanding of American Aquaculture. And the purpose of that was to try to establish national standards for what sustainable aquaculture actually was. It had some, there were some concerns, and it was very short on time at the end of the session. So it hasn't passed. I think something else will probably be introduced in this, this congressional term. But again, I think I just want to emphasize the work that California is doing. It's going to be very important to define what sustainability actually means. And that is going to be different for various types of aquaculture, whether it's bivalves or kelp or finfish.
Well, I think, I'm going to turn back to Mark for a moment on this, because you're right. The challenge is it's kind of like the wild, wild west. And if there's anything historically we can look at that fit in the same category of when people had fishing permits to go in certain areas in federal waters, and how we do that, and how you ensure, as we talk about equity and inclusion a lot, that AltaSea has been focused on, ensuring that whatever permitting process is established by the state of California is, kind of meets all those needs. So I would, Mark, I know, although you guys aren't leading all of this permitting, but you talked about shellfish and algae. Are there other areas, and from your kind of time, maybe in Hilda Bay and sustainability, that you'd say, oh, this is like what happened in this time or that time, for people to go, oh, okay, I now know it's going to take a little bit of time to get those regulations, and we're going to be some of the early ones, and here's how I'm going to do it. I know I threw a lot at you at that.
Yeah, that's a tough one, Wendy. One of the things that I would say is that, coming into this a couple of years ago, as a Newsom appointee, is that I did not have a lot of expertise in aquaculture. I'm not going to pretend that I did. It doesn't mean that I wasn't. It doesn't mean I was ignorant about it. I followed it very much from the standpoint of, I felt there was such a big need for sustainable seafood, and really moving in that direction in the state of California. And some of you may recall there was a Bill Monning bill from like 2008, 2009. We were literally on the cusp in the state of California of completing a sustainable seafood program through the Coastal Conservancy and the Ocean Protection Council. And it just literally tripped about 50 yards from the finish line, much to my dismay. And aquaculture was discussed as part of it, and it was not something that the commercial fishing, sport fishing community was really comfortable with at that point. And that's sort of how things have been, which is that the lack of interdepartmental, interagency focus and prioritization on it, I think that's the big change here. And so I think NOAA has actually been in the lead on this for quite some time. They've been pushing for this for a long time. The Sea Grant program has invested millions on aquaculture research, and that no exception here with UC Sea Grant. And so we're seeing a lot more science in that realm, a lot more academics working on aquaculture than they did before. And so I think we're really at a time right now where sometimes these problems everybody looks at and goes, forget it, it's just not worth it, it's just too much trouble. But you're hearing the commitment here from the state of California that that's not the case here, and that we're I can say from working with all the various different departments, the people are genuinely excited about, okay, let's move forward and do this in the most environmentally sound fashion possible. And because the way it's been working, which is reviewing one application at a time, when frankly, there's not adequate staffing in all the various different departments to actually process this. I'm sure Michael might have a comment on time is money on any business venture. And, if we're not, because it's not a big priority, we don't have adequate staffing, applications aren't getting processed and turned around in a quick enough fashion, that's not helping the industry as well. And so we want to make sure that by aligning all the various different departments that have some influence over this, that's going to help an awful lot. But to be candid, more resources are going to be needed. And the question is, will the industry grow enough where the funding from permitting will be adequate to actually move the industry forward? This is not a good comp, but one comp is looking at the shift in renewable energy in the state of California, where the reason the state of California has been able to staff up so tremendously on renewable energy and siting issues and impacts to the environment, et cetera, is because the industry has been able to subsidize a lot of the regulatory process there. We don't have that model yet on aquaculture. I'd love to hear from Sandra if she knows whether Rhode Island's been able to make that pencil out, or does it just have to be a subsidized effort? And I think the fact it has been subsidized by the state, and the state, you know, goes up and down financially, just like the feds, that makes it more of a challenge if you have to rely on general funding, general funds to actually make that happen. And I know, Wendy, you know that all too well from all your experience as controller for the city of Los Angeles, that a general fund dollar is very, very hard to come by. But if it's something you can get from the regulated community, it can work. But will the aquaculture industry be robust enough to provide those sorts of resources? That is still a very big unanswered question moving forward, but one we intend to really get an answer in developing this aquaculture action plan in the next couple of years, and really reaching out to stakeholders across the board.
Great. And Sandra, I'm going to turn to you in a minute. Questions that I have is relative to what's happening in Rhode Island, but I think the other is like aquaculture doesn't roll off your tongue very easily, number one, just generally, but two, it's not a common word that you see, you know, in daily lives of people understanding what it is and what it means. And I think you make a very good point, Mark, that oftentimes processes move forward, whether I'll think, you know, electric vehicles or solar or whatever, some of the other sustainable things. It took a while, but it was some ways it was the marketplace that helped push it a bit. At the same time, it was the right thing to do as well. So it's kind of a combination.
I would also add, Wendy, one other thing, and you know, obviously, you know, my brother was Jonathan Gold, who probably had as much insight, you know, on these issues in California and nationally as anybody, just with all the food writing that he had. And one of the things that I think we've really done a poor job, and that I think we're going to need to do a good job in this action plan moving forward, is differentiating between California aquaculture and United States aquaculture and international aquaculture. People don't realize that, you know, half of what they're eating is aquaculture. If they're eating shrimp, the chances are, you know, it's farm raised shrimp from Asia. And that's something that, you know, we can say in the LA area, because there are so many foodies in the region. It's such a huge part of our culture, that really knowing where your food comes from and how it was caught or how it was raised, I think is just a critical part of the discussion and the equation moving forward, and one that often isn't paid enough attention to, but I really hope we can change that.
And for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Gold was Mark's brother, who unfortunately had passed away, but was the food critic for the LA Times. And so we miss him, and was, as you say, was educational in his food critic position as well. Sandra.
Yeah, I just want to respond to and reemphasize what Mark just said, because you know, you were sort of asking a little bit about what's the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast aquaculture operations. Certainly in the Northeast, definitely in Rhode Island, most of the projects are really, you know, these are ocean farms. They're mom and pop organizations, you know, businesses. These are not industrial scale operations. And really they're mostly bivalves and usually oysters, because they have the highest value. But one of the things that the state of Rhode Island did, which really changed the economic equation for those mom and pop businesses, was a program that helped promote sort of Eat Rhode Island. You know, it's called Rhody Fresh. And what it allowed was that now, you know, it used to be 30 years ago, you'd go to a restaurant in Providence and you say, oh, I want an oyster. Well, now you say, I want a moonstone oyster, or I want a Quonset oyster, and what it means is that those farmers are getting a higher value, you know, they're getting a higher price for their oyster, and they're getting it more usually directly, as opposed to with, you know, a number of different middle people all getting a cut. So the marketing is also something that needs to be considered.
Great, I appreciate that. And I before I turn to Michael, I want to ask you a question as well, but is we're encouraging people, if you want to send in the chat any questions you might have to ask the panelists. We'll open it up in the next 5 minutes or so to questions. So I hope that we will get some questions in the Q&A. Michael, I'm going to turn to you a little bit on the issue of college and universities, and obviously this is partly a partnership with Cal State Northridge, and you're engaged with Dominguez Hills and others. But what are they doing right or could do better really in developing the workforce of the future for the blue economy? And it sounded like you wanted to add something else, so please comment on the.
To that point, going back to I had to go back for a family matter last week, and I was on Cape Cod, and I was talking to my cousins because there is, when it comes to say a resort, and they're like, we want to locally, source our food. They can grow a farm, but if you have oyster beds, it's so heavy. Talk about the original contact tracing, right? He can't go from right there in his oyster beds off of Brewster in the Flats right to the resorts that are around there, and they can have Brewster oysters at the Rawbah and everything else, because you've got this whole process. It's a heavy regulated industry, and that's kind of, I heard last week, part of the challenge is even if you grew a lot of this stuff off our shores, how you were able to. What are the laws, regulations, policies around making sure it gets into the local markets, and jumping to the universities, which, as I used this term before, talking about drivers of the economy, right? What used to drive LA's economy? It'd be aerospace, it was entertainment, it was manufacturing, and they don't need as many people to employ here in LA anymore. So we're kind of looking at higher education. What comes out of higher education, they become our anchor tenants. I mean, UCLA is probably, I think, the third largest job provider in LA now. And all the stuff that goes on in these campuses, one of my favorite pastimes is I have all the major colleges as part of the coalition. It's just reading their magazines they sent out and seeing what's going on those campuses, medical research and everything else. So in particular into this one, I think one of the challenges, right, is going from academia, going to the research dollars and grants that are subsidizing this in a way, is how do we get that into not just sustainable, market of blue economy, but sustainable businesses. And I think these partnerships, that's, partnering with Cal State Northridge on this one, with Altasea, that was a new introduction I was able to help facilitate. We need to continue to do that and continue to highlight, because the gentleman from Ferris Kawa last week said, is it hydroponics? Students were demanding it, and he didn't kind of fully pay attention to what they were demanding. And now he went back to the students and say, well, what do you exactly want to do? So, you can learn from professors and the leadership and from the students. I think, higher ed, what they're working on more, but on this particular issue is the interdisciplinary programs around this. It's not just the biology and engineering, but tying it to the business school, marketing, whatever you want, communications and anything else. I know CSUN is working on developing that right now. And then, looking at on the universities themselves, if you really want to highlight this issue and get people to understand its significance, creating a center on campus and creating, training. And this goes back to how would somebody get into this field, is certificate programs. You look at, there's a high percentage of people who go to the community colleges that already have bachelor degrees, because they're going back for that certificate to learn some other kind of specialty they didn't learn in the undergrad. So I think the more that, the CSUs and some of those folks can, work on some of that stuff, the better, because, there's still those traditional paths that people study of marine science programs. They go into environmental monitoring and water quality and natural resource jobs, or teaching. And as opposed to, how can we get, which, I believe there's that transfer of knowledge of turning ideas into jobs, into businesses and all that other stuff. And I think the last point, let's see, the other one is,
and my quick question, you all to see with what they're doing can help kind of bring those universities and campuses together, or even nationally start talking about this with some of those universities.
Correct. And that was funny, the call I was on there today with the Committee for Greater LA, talking about no center on homelessness. If somebody came from outer space and they landed and they had a question on the blue economy, like where would they start? They'd probably run into Mark Gold at some point or Sandra Whitehouse, but where's the center where all the data and all the resources and all the, the discussion of some of the policies are. And that's what I think, going back into this term, pardon the pun of the anchor tenant down at the port, being Altasea is being that center. And that's what the leadership has been doing, but they can't do it all on their own. That's why they've been partnering or having people like us, facilitate those additional partnerships. I know Santa Monica City College has a partnership there. We're building the partnership with CSUN. This is, part of that process. And I think there's mass opportunity, but we're still kind of socializing the understanding of what this really means.
Great. I'm going to go back to you, Sandra, for 1 minute, because I think the, state issues seem huge, and regulations and, city regulations similarly, depending upon which city may be next to it, and coastal, all the things that you do. But the federal waters, that seems like overly, kind of want to scratch your head. How does that happen? And a lot of, interest in that and offshore agriculture and investment. Does that the scale of what should and could happen in federal waters really, does it mean they have to be make those operations environmentally unsustainable?
Well, first, let me just say, the United States has pretty much the largest EEZ in the world. We have the largest waters that belong to us as a country. We have a total of 2 federally permitted aquaculture projects, one off Southern California and a much smaller one in the Gulf of Maine. I mean, fly into Oslo, you fly over one aquaculture facility in Norway after another. So, I think we have a lot of room for growth. I think the challenge in some cases is less about scale and more about what Mark touched upon, which is, how do you actually define sustainability? And there really are significant differences among kelp farming, bivalve, oysters and clams farming, and finfish farming. And I think from a environmental group's perspective, the former 2, the kelp and the bivalves, are pretty well understood, pretty well accepted. The environmental impacts seem to be quite low. In fact, in some cases, there's actually even an argument for environmental impacts being positive. I think it's the finfish that people seem to be the most concerned about. So I would think, at least initially, to think less about scale and more about species.
That's helpful. And I've learned a lot today, but the fact that we own the most of the, in the world is pretty amazing. I don't think I would have ever anticipated that necessarily. So
throw in all of our islands.
Yeah. There you go. So I have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm going to go to those, and I, kind of want to open it up to all of you as you want to answer these questions. So from Anthony Michaels, he said, capital is a key limitation for growing an aquaculture business. And so what should be done to make the regulations and policy more investor friendly? So like transparency and ROI and risk mitigation, things like that would both be from some of your, Michael, maybe the business perspective, and from your experience, Sandra and Mark, from the environmental and experiences.
First of all, I mean, Anthony knows from which he's asking that question, so it's pretty loaded since he's actually been in the space for a while. And
everybody, Mark, he got caught.
But that being said, one of the things that I've seen, and I think this is true, going back to a question you asked Wendy, which is what's comparable, is that I think this is true in really any environmental field. Everybody points to how rigorous an environmental law is. And the biggest issue in the regulated community, which doesn't get talked about enough, is uncertainty and really understanding, what exactly are the boundaries on the playing field? What are the expectations from the standpoint of how long should it take to process a permit application, what sorts of aquaculture projects are welcome in the state of California and really going to be supported and get through quickly, and which locations are considered, as environmentally benign as possible. The more certainty there is in that, I think that's, I am not somebody who's well-versed on the investment side, but at least from the business perspective, just that part of it is going to make it a lot easier to sort of understand whether the investment is going to actually be worthwhile. And that has been sorely missing in not only in California, but really nationally, which is, again, it's like each one of these major proposals is almost dealt with like it's the first time, and it's not really building on what's happened with all the other sorts of aquaculture proposals. And that's, that's an overgeneralization, but that's something that we need to do a heck of a lot better on. And so we hope to get there in the next couple of years and provide much greater certainty in that realm.
Sandra, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, I'm going to add to that. When you asked the question, I jotted down regulatory certainty as the answer. So thank you, Mark, for giving my answer. But I'd like to just touch upon the wind example and draw a connection there. Rhode Island being the first state that had a turbine in the water. There's, we have 5 in the now in the water. There's 2 in Virginia now. Again, compare this to European countries that have literally thousands and thousands in water already, creating
or President Biden's 30 gigawatt goal, for the next 15 years.
Exactly. But, I get back to the importance. Regulatory certainty is not only how you're going to do it and being able to define what those sustainable standards are. It's very importantly where you're going to do it. And that's where a lot of conflicts come into play. And that's why the state and federal planning efforts and the West Coast partnership, regional partnership, is that what it's called now, Mark? The Marine Spatial Planning entity.
Oh, under NOAA or the overall one?
The overall one.
I'm blanking on the name too. I'm sorry.
I think it's called the West Coast Regional Partnership.
Okay.
They're doing some planning not only for aquaculture, but for and they're working very closely with the NOAA Aquaculture Program for all kinds of different uses. And having, again, like this is not pre-permitting. This is being able to say this is a site that is suitable for this type of activity based on the science, based on the environmental concerns, based on the other users. Is it a highly an area highly used by recreational fishermen? And so the ocean planning work we have seen really clearly on the East Coast has dramatically contributed to regulatory certainty for offshore wind developers. And I believe that it can for the aquaculture industry as well.
But again, I hate to be a little bit of a contrarian here, Sandra, but again,
go for it.
Again, the energy industry has just a completely different scale of resources to throw at a problem. So if you have fisheries impacts, and really Rhode Island's been the leader on this from the standpoint of creating mitigation for the fishing industry, where there's compensation for lost fisheries. And whereas aquaculture, if there's impacts on the fishing community, the revenues don't scale up that you can really afford the mitigation. And so there's a scaling issue here and a revenue generation issue here that makes this a lot tougher, I think, than wind in that regard. And I'm not saying wind's easy, but at least the revenues are there on energy generation. They're just not there on the aquaculture industry. It's just too small a scale at this point.
Yeah, and going back to when you were saying earlier about who's going to pay for some of this planning work, for the ocean plan for the state of Rhode Island that expedited and facilitated the first wind farm, the developer actually puts a significant amount of money into just basically data collection and shared a lot of their proprietary data. So, you know, they did have those resources.
And I think that is important. I mean, again, when there's that certainty, so whether, again, you look at electric vehicles or you look at wind or solar or whatever it may be, when a governmental regulatory entity says we are either one going to invest or this is something we're going to require, then the private sector investment can come in to be able to help grow that industry particularly. And so I think that's where people try to understand. And in fact, there's a question as well in here about whether or not the U.S. seafood industry has shown an interest in this project and aquaculture, and if so, is there a hesitancy towards that? Is it that there aren't clear regulations, or it takes too long, or there's not enough investment in it? What would you say in that? I don't know, Michael or Sandra.
I can't remember the exact number, Wendy, but there's something like 20 different proposals in the queue in the state of California. And there was actually a little bit of a moratorium on processing that for two reasons. One was lack of resources to do so, and two, because of environmental concerns. And, you know, that's going to change really soon. So it's not, there has been interest and again, I think this uncertainty has really been a big part of the issue. And so, you know, all I can promise the audience is that really there's a lot of folks who are trying to change that right now and say, hey, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. And that's really what this is all about.
And there was one last question, and then I'm going to ask each of you in a lightning round of like any last minute second thing you want to add to in the last few minutes. But the question from Janet was, does agriculture of seaweeds for biofuels solve this investment issue at all? Any of you familiar with?
You know, I mean, this is going back to my UCLA days. I mean, I know UC San Diego in particular was pretty focused in this issue, and I don't know whether the investment in doing that research is scaled up to the point of actual any sort of commercial investment. But I know that interest was there and has been there for the better part of a decade. But I have not heard anything new and exciting in that front. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I would have hoped I would have heard about it, at least at the state level, if something like that was really moving forward. So the best of my knowledge, at least not in California.
I mean, I'll weigh in from the New England perspective, and had a conversation fairly recently with some people working in Connecticut growing kelp and seaweeds, and they're selling it for human consumption. So yeah, that's a much more valuable commodity that, you know, I'm assuming than a biofuel is going to be.
Right, and the algae that's usually used for biofuels is really more, you know, it's not something like kelp or red algae or something like that. It's usually, you know, some sort of microscopic phytoplankton with high energy content, and so it's sort of a different game.
So Michael, I'm gonna start with you. If you had to leave this audience with, you know, opportunity or challenge, what would that be going forward?
Well, first of all, you know, the blue economy, someone said that potentially 100 million jobs, a lot of good paying from low wage to high wage. Think about hundreds of new innovations from it, and people can not only, you know, work in the environmental aspect, but they have an opportunity to work in a job that can save the planet, save the human species. And the three takeaways from going, Jermaine, to this ending of the conversation from a lot of investors I talk about who are investing in renewable, it's the difference between rhetoric, just like a campaign, and following the money. And on this one, I think probably if we're going to unlock it, because we're not going to have industrial scale farming out here, if you have the smaller, potentially like Rhode Island, everything else is, you know, support local, try to figure out how to support local, that local chain of the you know, healthier foods, limit regulations, and make sure of all these people that want to get into this field is give people some local license to be innovative. Give them a chance, know the rules of the road, know what they can and they can't do. So, and I know we've got the best working on that with Mark and Sandra, some other folks. So I thank them.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for all you're doing to see. And Sandra, I'm going to go to you. Opportunities, challenges.
I think opportunity. I really think that now is a very exciting time to be launching this this offshore industry. As I said, we have virtually a blank slate, and certainly in federal waters. The challenges are going to be investment and siting and all the things that we've talked about. I have not in my career seen as much interest on the federal level from both the administration and Congress in terms of advancing offshore aquaculture, and I hope that we can seize this moment.
Great, thank you, Sandra. And Mark, we're going to give you the last word there.
Oh, that's dangerous. I just want to remind the audience that we didn't spend any time really talking about land-based aquaculture, and I think that's a really important part of this as well. And so, if you're eating farmed abalone, chances are it's land-based aquaculture from Santa Barbara County area, as an example. And so that's an area that the state of California would seriously look at any finfish land-based aquaculture. It's really the ocean side that we've really been focusing on. And then the last thing, which is, I think there's going to be an opportunity for people to get a lot more involved, right? The development of this aquaculture action plan is going to include a very significant stakeholder engagement process. We really want to consult with the tribes, as an example, in a major way. We also want to ensure the fishing community, both sport and commercial, are heavily engaged with. People in the aquaculture industry already, the environmental conservation community in addition, and just other interested members of the public. And so that effort is going to begin in earnest probably within the next 6 months or so, and as part of this aquaculture action plan development. So I just wanted to reassure the audience that this isn't just something that's going to occur in some back room and get negotiated out, but that the public is really going to have an opportunity to weigh in on. And I just think that's really, really, really important and a good opportunity to do so. And hold us accountable to 2023, that we'll have an aquaculture action plan in place by then, because we've already waited too long, and we really need to move forward on this.
Well, I think that's a good high note for a variety of reasons. And first and foremost, I want to thank our three speakers and panelists, Michael Kelly, Mark Gold, and Sandra Whitehouse, for participating and educating people. And I think that the intent of this series is really to develop that support system, that transparency, that accountability, and this allows people to get educated about it. And so we challenge those of you that are out there listening today to the series, go out and start bringing other people to the table about investment, about supporting it, and being able to educate people about the future to address the really wonderful opportunities of aquaculture, and that there are exciting things happening on the local, state, and federal level. And with these three people and AltaSea combined, making a big difference. So thank you all for participating. I really appreciate it. An hour goes by just like that. So thank you all very much. Have a great evening and really appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, AltaSea.